we are continuing our habit of paying very close attention to what the leaders in AI are talking about. And we're doing another deep dive into that this week. This time, we are looking at an interview that was just given by Aidan Gomez, who is the co founder and CEO of Cohere, which is a leading large language model company. Gomez just gave an hour-long interview to Harry Stebbings on the popular 20BC podcast and covered a ton of really interesting topics, including things like he believes that AI appears to be nowhere near plateauing in its capabilities. He talks about small versus large models and the advantages of each. He mentions how hard it's getting to train models to be better and more powerful. And he claims that OpenAI has put AGI on the back burner in favor of becoming a consumer facing app company. So, Paul, what jumped out to you as worth paying attention to in this interview? Maybe kind of also just give us a really quick sense of like who Gomez is and why he's worth listening to.
Yeah, so we have talked about Aiden, a number of times before on the podcast. We've talked about Cohere quite a bit. So Aiden was one of the 9 authors of the "Attention is All You Need" paper in 2017 that Google Brain published that invented the transformer. So we've talked about the transformer as the basis for GPT. It's the basis for large language models today. So he was an intern at the time, I believe, in the Google Brain team, but he was one of the 9 cited authors of that paper. So he left to co-found Cohere. They've raised about $1 billion at somewhere between a $5 and a $6 billion valuation. As we've talked in recent weeks and months, though, that's not a lot of money in the Gen AI space. I mean, a billion sounds like a lot, but I mean, Inflection had raised $1.5 billion before they got acqui-hired. Character.ai had raised probably close to $1 billion. I don't remember their exact number before they got acqui-hired recently. So these numbers sound big, but in reality, in order to compete with the frontier model companies, the OpenAIs and Anthropics and Meta and Google, $1 billion is not much. And so that's actually kind of part of the basis for the interview is like, well, how are you building a large language model company differently that allows you to keep competing and not get acqui-hired? And I'm not saying they're not going to get acqui-hired, but up till now, they have not. Um, I'll hit on a few of the trends. Again, I think it's a worthwhile listen. Like if you are a listener who enjoys kind of going a little deeper on these, as Mike said, hearing from the people that are building the models, building these, the major Gen AI companies, it's worth your time to really hear their full perspective. But I'll just highlight some of the key themes that jumped out at me. So on the topic of making bot models bigger, kind of this idea of scaling laws that we keep talking about, that if we just keep giving more NVIDIA chips to them, more data and more time to train, they just get smarter. That's the basic premise of the scaling laws. And he said it's definitely true, and I'll just quote here, it's definitely true that if you throw more compute at the model, if you make the model bigger, it'll get better. It's kind of like its most trustworthy way to improve models. It's also the dumbest. Um, he said, I just think it's extremely inefficient. There are much better ways. And then he said, there's a lot of pressure on making smaller, more efficient models smarter via data and algorithms, methods, rather than just scaling up due to market forces. There's pressure on price. So his main thing is like, yeah, the models are going to keep getting smarter and more generally capable. If you are one of the 5 frontier model companies that has billions of dollars to spend, if not tens or hundreds of billions, then yes, you can keep building much larger models. And he is a believer in the scaling laws. He doesn't see them ending anytime soon. So then he went on to talk about these smaller, more efficient models. He says, we live in this world of unbundled, verticalized models, which are much more efficient and smaller, designed for specific use cases. He says there will be both. We will have these massive general models, and then we will have these smaller, verticalized models. And that's just how it's going to go. So you have some verticalized and then the horizontal, generally capable ones. On the question of competing with frontier model companies, specifically Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Facebook, and then you add OpenAI and Anthropic to that list, he said, I think you're just doing the scaling project. You have to be one of those, or you have to be an effective subsidiary of one of those companies. So in other words, if you want to build the big, generally capable models, it's only going to come from one of those 5 companies or someone who's basically getting a bunch of money from them and functions like a subsidiary, but isn't being acquired because of constraints right now. He said pretty much all of the major gains that we've seen in open source space have come from data improvements, though. Models getting much better by taking higher quality data from the internet, better scraping algorithms, parsing those web pages, pulling out the right parts, upweighting specific parts of the internet because there's a lot of repetition and junk. So this goes, we've talked about this idea before, but when these models are trained, when GPT-5 is trained, it just sucks in all available content. Just imagine all the text on the internet going into it. Maybe it's multimodal, maybe they're training it on images and videos and audio too, but it's basically taking all of this data. Then what these researchers have to do is apply weights to the importance of different sources. So what they're going to do is say like research papers are better than Reddit boards. And so they may give more weight in the training of these models to content that comes from research papers that have been published in journals, as an example, or authored books. It's why they take from books three, the pirated, 180,000 books, because the assumption is stuff that's been published through actual publishing houses, through publishers, is better. It's why they take from the New York Times and all these other places. So what he's saying is they are definitely seeing that the higher the quality of data, the less volume of data you need. And that's a really key thing that they've learned now in the last couple of years. Um, so he says pulling out the most valuable knowledge rich parts of the internet and emphasizing those to the models, telling it like, focus on this. This is the good stuff. He talked about system two thinking. This is a topic we have touched on many times on the podcast. So he says the status quo with models is I ask you a question and the model is expected to respond immediately with the right answer. That's an incredibly high burden to place on the model. Like you couldn't do that to a human. So again, system one thinking is I ask Mike a question, Mike replies immediately. System two thinking is I ask Mike a question and Mike ponders it for a while. He says, let me think about that. Then maybe he takes 30 seconds, maybe he takes 30 minutes, and then he comes back. Well, what happened is Mike thought through things. He went through a chain of thought. He applied reasoning and logic. He drew on his experiences, and then he came back and gave me an answer. That's what they're trying to do with these machines. They're trying to give them the ability when they have a harder problem to stop and think about it. That's system two thinking. And so he said, that there's this very obvious next step for models, which is where you need to let them think and work through problems. Um, and he says, right now, there's no real true notion of problem solving. Now, the thing I thought was fascinating here, because he was asked, like, why is that so hard?
Hmm.
And he said, because they learn from data on the internet, and the internet is full of outputs, not the actual reasoning process. So when you read something on the internet, you're just seeing the final product. You don't see the work that went into the final product. So what they're having to do is actually train these models on the thought process that goes into that final output. So if they want to train it on an article, it's like, well, what did that person do to write the article? What process did they go through? How did they make these decisions? And he said that stuff's not freely available. And so that's where they're investing a lot of their time, is actually teaching the machine how to think, because there's no representative data of that on the internet.
Hmm.
That led into the importance of data. So they asked him, like, what have you changed your mind about in the last 12 months? And he said, it's the data. I underrated it dramatically. I thought it was just scale. So up until 12 months ago, he thought just build the bigger models. The other one I like is he talked about voice. So we talked about like the advanced voice mode coming from OpenAI and how people aren't really ready for that. He said anyone who has tried having a voice-based conversation with one of these models, it's a stunning experience. You're left in shock when you hear the model exhibiting emotion and inflection, and you hear it breathe before it speaks, and you hear it lip smacking. So this is someone at the frontier who is telling you, like, this is crazy stuff. And that's been my experience having seen it so far. And then the couple other ones, the models are getting much faster and much smarter. So he talks about how they are obviously becoming way faster, a lot due to the data and the improvements in the algorithms. He got into enterprise adoption. He said that they're really scared. So one of the reasons why these, lack of adoption enterprises, they're scared people are going to take their data, train on it, and put in some security vulnerability, or that they lose their IP. Said it's a valid concern, but he's seeing a major shift. Last year was a lot of proof of concepts. This year, he's seeing an urgency to adopt. Touched on AI agent hype, and he said it's 100% justified. These things are going to transform productivity, and they're coming. We've all been working on them for the last year to 2 years, and we're going to see a massive change there. And then the last two, what's coming soon that people are missing. He talked again about reasoning and planning as the major thing that is these things are going to be capable of. And then he touched on robotics, which we've talked about, is the embedding of these models, this intelligence into humanoid robots and what that'll enable in the economy. And he said, I think robotics is the place where there will be big breakthroughs. Cost needs to come down, but it's happening. And then the models that are there are much more robust. So someone's going to crack these general purpose humanoid robots. And then the final thing, which I thought was really interesting, because we were all this like, I want to pursue AGI, we're going to solve intelligence. He's very practical. So he was asked, like, where do you want it to go? And he said, I think that the world is super supply constrained, and pretty much every luxury we have today has come from technology that is developed to increase productivity, boost the supply of things, make them more abundant, make them cheaper. And so, what I really care about with this technology is driving productivity for the world and making humans more effective, able to do more. So that's he's building a company focused on these smaller verticalized models. They have open source models, they have proprietary models, they do on-prem installations for enterprises, they do cloud installations through the major cloud companies. So they're kind of playing all, but he's very focused on let's just augment humans. Let's drive productivity to create a world of abundance. So yeah, I mean, Aiden's great. I love listening to his stuff. And like I said, I think it's a worthwhile listen for anybody who wants to understand the different approaches people are taking and the different leaders who are out there.